The heavy, oak-paneled door of the conference room clicked shut, the sound as final as a gavel. It sealed the five of them inside an atmosphere thick with cloying perfume, expensive leather, and the triumphant arrogance of the Croft family. Ethan Sterling sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table, a lone island in a sea of hostility. Across from him, his wife Isabella, her face a mask of cold resolve. Flanking her were her father Richard, a man whose tailored suit could not hide the weakness in his character. Her mother Eleanor, whose pearls seemed to be strangling the last of her compassion. And her brother Liam, the epicenter of this entire disaster, fidgeting with the entitled impatience of a spoiled child. In the center of the table, stark against the dark wood, lay a sheaf of papers. A post-nuptial agreement, a surrender document. "It's very simple, Ethan," Isabella said, her voice stripped of the warmth he once cherished. It was now a tool, sharp and precise. "You sign it or you lose everything. The house, the club memberships, the cars, your entire life. We will take it all. Sign the papers, agree to secure the loan for Liam, and we can begin to move past this unpleasantness." Her words hung in the air, a declaration of war disguised as a peace treaty. Richard smirked, a reptilian flicker of a smile. Eleanor examined her fingernails as if the fate of a man she'd called son for 5 years was a triviality beneath her notice. Liam just looked greedy, his eyes fixed on Ethan as if he were a walking, talking ATM. They saw a quiet, unassuming architect, a man of modest habits and even more modest origins. They saw a resource to be plundered. They saw a nail to be hammered down. Ethan's gaze drifted from the document to Isabella's face. He searched for a flicker of the woman he married, the art history student who had once claimed to love his quiet intensity, who found beauty in his detailed sketches of imaginary cities. He found nothing. Her eyes were as hard and reflective as the diamonds on her fingers, gifts he had given her. "Everything?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly calm in the charged silence. "Everything," she confirmed, mistaking his quiet for fear. "Don't test me on this, Ethan. My family needs this. I need this. Your little architectural projects can't possibly be more important than our family's security and reputation." He let the insult, the casual diminishment of his life's work, settle over him. He felt its familiar weight. For years he had borne the 1,000 tiny cuts of their condescension, the endless parade of slights at family dinners, the thinly veiled mockery of his profession. He had endured it for her, for the dream of a life he thought they were building together. Now he saw the foundation of that life was sand, and the tide was coming in. He picked up the heavy, gold-plated fountain pen provided by the lawyer, Mr. Alastair Vance, who sat silently at the far end of the table, his face a study in professional neutrality. Ethan felt the smooth, cold metal in his hand. He looked at the signature line, Ethan Sterling. His name, his identity. They wanted him to sign it away. He met Isabella's gaze one last time. A silent plea passed from him to her. "Don't do this. See me. Remember us." Her expression didn't soften. It hardened further, a silent command. "Sign." So he did. With a steady hand, he uncapped the pen. The scratch of the nib on the thick, creamy paper was the only sound in the room. He signed his name with the same careful precision he used to draft a blueprint. It was a simple, elegant signature, unwavering, final. He slid the document back across the table. A collective sigh of relief and victory seemed to pass through the Croft family. Liam's shoulders relaxed. Richard's smirk widened into a full-blown grin. Isabella gave a sharp, satisfied nod. They had won. The little man had been put in his place. "Excellent," Richard boomed, clapping his hands together. "Sense prevails. Now, about the terms of that loan, Vance." But Alastair Vance wasn't looking at Richard. He was looking at Ethan. A slow, knowing smile spread across the lawyer's face, a smile that held none of the expected deference. It was a smile of complicity, of a shared secret. He picked up the signed document, his movements crisp and deliberate. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Vance said, his voice resonating with a newfound respect that startled the Crofts. "With your signature on Exhibit A, the conditions of the Sterling Trust are now fully satisfied." Isabella's triumphant expression froze. A flicker of confusion crossed her features. "Sterling Trust? What are you talking about? That's a post-nuptial agreement." Vance's smile didn't waver. He turned his gaze, now cool and appraising, upon her. It was the look of a man who held all the cards. "Oh, it's a post-nuptial agreement, all right, Miss Croft. A very, very binding one. The one you had your father's legal team draft. The one that explicitly states that in the event of a separation, you waive any and all claims to Mr. Sterling's personal and business assets, in exchange for him assuming a portion of your family's debt." The color began to drain from Isabella's face. "Yes, so? He signed. He has to get the loan for Liam." "He doesn't have to do anything," Vance said, his tone turning sharp. "He signed, accepting your terms, the primary term being a dissolution of the marriage. The document you just had him sign was the final piece of legal maneuvering required to completely and irrevocably separate his finances from yours and your family's. Before the filing of the divorce papers, which, by the way, are right here." He tapped a second, much thicker document on the table. "You just handed the man you tried to bankrupt the perfect, ironclad legal instrument to protect himself from you." The silence that followed was absolute. The air, once thick with arrogance, was now thin and sharp with shock. Isabella stared at the lawyer, then at Ethan, her mouth slightly agape. The carefully constructed mask was cracking, revealing the panicked confusion beneath. She had been so sure of her power, of his weakness. But the lawyer wasn't smiling at her. He was smiling at Ethan. And in that moment, Isabella Croft went deathly pale. The sudden, terrifying understanding dawning in her eyes that the game she thought she was winning had been over before she even sat down at the table. She hadn't just lost the argument, she had lost everything. Thank you for being here for the start of this journey. So many of us have felt underestimated or unappreciated, and this story is for every single one of us who has dreamed of the moment the tables turn. Do you know that feeling? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, if you're ready for the full story, for the years of quiet humiliation and secret preparation that led to this single, devastating moment, make sure you've hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss how we got here. Let's go back. Let's go back 3 years, to a dinner party where the first seeds of this destruction were sown in the name of family. 3 years earlier, the crystal glasses on the Croft family's dining table chimed with a delicate, expensive sound. The air was perfumed with roasted lamb and Eleanor's signature Chanel No. 5. It was Richard's birthday, and the family had gathered in a performance of familial harmony that was as meticulously crafted as the floral centerpiece. Ethan sat beside Isabella, feeling, as he often did in this house, like a foreign object. He was a sturdy, well-made piece of oak furniture in a room decorated entirely in gilded rococo. He was functional, reliable, and completely out of place. He had tried, in the beginning. He had worn the bespoke suits Isabella bought for him, laughed at Richard's stale jokes about golf and quarterly reports, and listened with feigned interest to Eleanor's breathless accounts of charity galas and social rivalries. He did it for Isabella, believing his love for her could bridge the chasm between his world and hers. His world was one of clean lines, structural integrity, and the quiet satisfaction of creating something beautiful and enduring from raw materials. Their world was one of surfaces, of appearances, of a status so fragile it required constant, exhausting reinforcement. Tonight, the reinforcement was being provided by Liam, fresh from a 6-month stint in business school that seemed to have taught him jargon, but not wisdom. He was holding court. "It's the future, Dad," Liam announced, waving his fork for emphasis and nearly spearing a bread roll. "Mixed-use luxury developments. We're not just selling condos, we're selling a lifestyle. The Pinnacle at Waterfront East. It's a gold mine. The zoning is practically a sure thing, and I've got the inside track." Richard beamed, his chest swelling with paternal pride. "That's my boy, always thinking big. Not like some people, content to draw their pretty little pictures." He winked in Ethan's direction, the gesture meant to be jovial, but landing like a stone. It was a familiar jab. Richard could not comprehend Ethan's profession. To him, an architect who wasn't a flamboyant celebrity was just a glorified draftsman. He couldn't grasp the complex interplay of physics, engineering, artistry, and finance that went into shaping the skyline. "Waterfront East is a tricky area," Ethan said quietly, not rising to the bait. He had studied the city's development plans for his own professional interest. "The subsoil is notoriously unstable, and the community board there is very resistant to anything that casts a shadow over the old park." Liam scoffed, a spray of wine escaping his lips. "Oh, here we go. Professor Sterling with his lecture. Ethan, this is the big leagues. It's not about drawing a nice porch for some suburban family. This is about vision, about risk. There's a difference between calculated risk and a foolish gamble," Ethan replied, his tone even. "Have you done the geotechnical surveys? Have you seen the city's latest environmental impact studies for that quadrant?" "Blah, blah, blah, technicalities," Liam said, waving a dismissive hand. "That's what you hire people for. The important thing is the vision, and I have it. You wouldn't understand. You're too cautious. You've got no ambition." Ethan felt a familiar sting. He looked at Isabella, expecting her to intervene, to defend him, or at least to change the subject. She met his gaze for a fleeting second, a hint of apology in her eyes, before looking down at her plate. She remained silent. Her silence was a choice, a small betrayal that echoed louder in Ethan's heart than all her family's insults combined. In that moment, he saw their future diverge. She was choosing their world of glittering surfaces over his world of solid foundations. "Well," Eleanor chimed in, eager to steer the conversation back to her son's brilliance, "I think it sounds terribly exciting. A pinnacle. It sounds so tall. I'm sure you'll be a tremendous success, darling. You have your father's head for business." Ethan took a slow sip of water. He could have told them. He could have opened the worn leather portfolio he'd brought with him, the one leaning against his chair. He could have pulled out the preliminary designs he was working on, under a pseudonym, for the new corporate headquarters of a Fortune 500 company, the very company Richard sat on the board of. He could have shown them the contracts, the financials, the evidence that his pretty little pictures were shaping the very city they lived in and generating a level of wealth they couldn't begin to imagine. He could have told them that his quiet, methodical approach had allowed him to build an empire while they were busy polishing the family silver. He had built his firm, Athelred Designs, an old English play on his name that no one had ever bothered to decipher, from the ground up. He was the sole, anonymous owner. He took on projects that interested him, projects that challenged him, projects that made a difference. He lived modestly not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He wanted his work, not his wealth, to define him. And he had wanted more than anything for his wife to love the man, not the portfolio. But he said nothing. He simply nodded. "I wish you the best of luck, Liam." The words were genuine, but they were also a test. He was giving Liam the rope. He was watching to see if he would weave a ladder or a noose. As Liam launched into another boastful monologue about his inevitable success, Ethan felt a profound sense of clarity. He loved his wife, but she was a part of a system, a family unit that was fundamentally unsound. Its foundations were rotten with pride and arrogance, and he knew, with the certainty of a master builder, that such a structure could not stand forever. He ate his lamb, tasted the expensive wine, and quietly began to draw up a different kind of blueprint in his mind, not for a building, but for his own survival. The months that followed were a case study in dramatic irony. Liam's gold mine, the pinnacle at Waterfront East, quickly revealed itself to be a sinkhole. Just as Ethan had quietly predicted, the geotechnical surveys, which Liam had belatedly and expensively commissioned, came back with catastrophic results. The ground was unsuitable for a high-rise of that scale without deep, prohibitively expensive foundation work. The community board, galvanized by a well-funded local preservation society, launched a fierce and effective campaign against the zoning variance, citing the very shadow studies Ethan had mentioned. The project was bleeding money, and Liam, who had leveraged himself to the hilt based on his own hype, was in freefall. The family's mood soured. The celebratory toasts were replaced with hushed, anxious phone calls. The target of their conversations, however, was not Liam's folly, but Ethan's perceived intransigence. It was his fault for being negative, his fault for not being a team player, his fault for being right, which was the most unforgivable sin of all. The breaking point came not at a dinner party, but at a grim family summit convened in Richard and Eleanor's drawing room. The room, usually a stage for social triumphs, now felt like a war room. Liam, looking pale and haggard, sat slumped in an armchair, the picture of a defeated general. Richard paced the antique carpet, his face florid with anger and stress. "It's a temporary liquidity problem," Richard announced to the room, though his eyes were fixed on Ethan. The boy was ambitious. He took a swing. In our world, you have to take swings. But the banks are getting nervous. The investors are getting cold feet. We need to shore up his position, show a united front. Ethan remained silent, watching the play unfold. He knew it was more than a liquidity problem. He had seen the financials, thanks to a discreet inquiry made by Alistair Vance. Liam was insolvent. He was facing not just bankruptcy, but potential fraud charges from investors he had misled about the project's viability. "We all need to pull together," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly as she looked at her wilting son. "Family is all we have in times like these." Her gaze, too, landed on Ethan. It was an accusation. Then came the proposal, delivered by Isabella. She had been quiet until now, perched on the arm of Liam's chair, a protective hand on his shoulder. When she spoke, her voice was firm, rehearsed. "Ethan," she began, standing and walking to the center of the room, taking on the role of prosecutor. "We need your help. You have a stable income. You have excellent credit. We need you to go to your bank and secure a personal loan, a significant one, enough to cover Liam's immediate obligations and restore confidence." Ethan looked at her, truly looked at her. There was no softness in her eyes, only a hard, desperate calculation. "Isabella," he said, his voice low and even, "you're asking me to take on millions of dollars of debt to bail out a failed project, a project I advised against from the beginning." "Advised?" Liam spat from his chair. "You jinxed it. You put your bad energy on it from the start." "Don't be a child, Liam," Richard snapped, before turning back to Ethan. "This isn't about who was right or wrong. This is about family loyalty. We took you in, Ethan. We gave you a life you could only have dreamed of. We gave you our daughter. This is you paying your dues." The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of the statement left Ethan momentarily speechless. They had given him a life? He thought of the endless hours he worked, the creativity he poured into his designs, the silent empire he had built while they were busy attending regattas. The life they lived, the luxuries Isabella enjoyed, were funded by his success, not theirs. A success they were too blind to see. "I won't do it," Ethan said, the words falling like stones into the silence. It's not a sound financial decision. It would be throwing good money after bad. I will not put my own financial security, and by extension Isabella's, at that kind of risk. The reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. Ungrateful! Eleanor shrieked. How dare you? Richard roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. After everything we've done for you! But it was Isabella's reaction that cut him to the core. Her face contorted, not with anger, but with a kind of cold fury. You see, she said, turning to her parents, as if Ethan were a misbehaving pet. You see what I have to deal with? This is what I married. A small man, a man with no soul, no loyalty. He would let my brother, my own flesh and blood, be destroyed over money. She turned back to him, her eyes blazing. This is my family, Ethan. Their problems are my problems, and they should be your problems too. If you won't do this for them, you are doing nothing for me. You are choosing your bank account over your wife. He stood up, the calm in his demeanor a stark contrast to their hysteria. No, Isabella, I am choosing reality over fantasy. I am choosing solvency over ruin. This is not about a lack of loyalty. This is about a refusal to participate in a collective delusion. He walked towards the door, the weight of their combined hatred pressing in on him. As his hand touched the doorknob, Isabella's voice, laced with venom, followed him. You'll regret this, Ethan. I will make you regret this. He paused but didn't turn around. I think the regrets have been a long time coming for all of us, he said, and walked out. Later that night, the house was silent and cold. Isabella had locked herself in the guest room. Ethan sat in his study, the one place in the sprawling, ostentatious house that felt like his own. It was simple, furnished with clean lines and books on structural engineering. He looked at the phone on his desk for a long time. He had hoped it would never come to this. He had held out a desperate, foolish hope that Isabella would eventually see past the glitter of her family's world and appreciate the solid ground he stood on. Her words echoed in his head. A small man. He finally picked up the receiver and dialed a number from memory. It was answered on the first ring. Vance. The voice was crisp, professional. Alistair, it's Ethan Sterling. There was a pause, then the voice softened slightly. Ethan, I was wondering when you might call. I've been following the public filings on the Waterfront East project. It's not pretty. It's about to get uglier, Ethan said, his voice tight. They want me to bail him out, personally. And you, wisely, refused. It wasn't a question. I refused, Ethan confirmed. Isabella, she's siding with them. Completely. I think she's about to declare war. Then we need to be prepared, Vance said calmly. The contingency plans we drew up 5 years ago, when you first established the trust, are they still your wish? Ethan looked around his study, at the life he had tried to build, the love he had tried to nurture. It was all a facade, a beautiful, expensive, hollow shell. The only real thing was his work, the integrity of his own creations, and he would not allow them to shatter that. Yes, Ethan said, a new resolve hardening in his voice. It's time. Let's begin the preparations. Activate everything. Consider it done, Alistair Vance replied. They're about to learn that the most dangerous thing in the world is to underestimate a quiet man. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in passive aggression. The sprawling house, once a stage for their social life, became a cold, silent battlefield. Ethan was treated as a non-entity, a ghost haunting the spaces he paid for. Isabella communicated with him only through terse, formal notes left on the kitchen island or via text messages that were cold and brutally efficient. Meals were eaten in silence, if they were eaten together at all. She began sleeping permanently in the guest room, creating a physical chasm that mirrored the emotional one that had opened between them. The pressure from her family was relentless. Ethan could only imagine the conversations, the daily calls from Eleanor, weeping about the family's impending social ruin, the angry tirades from Richard about Ethan's unforgivable insubordination. They were working on Isabella, chipping away at any lingering affection or loyalty she might have for her husband, reinforcing the narrative that he was the villain, the sole obstacle to their family's salvation. One evening, Ethan came home to find Richard's black Mercedes parked in the driveway. He entered the house to the sound of hushed, intense voices coming from the living room. He paused in the hallway, hidden by the shadows of a large, abstract sculpture he'd always hated. "He is making a fool of you, Isabella." Richard's voice was a low, venomous hiss. "And by extension, he is making a fool of me, of this family. I have members of my club, people I have done business with for 30 years, asking me why my son-in-law won't step up. It's humiliating." "What do you want me to do, Daddy?" Isabella's voice was strained, weary. "I've tried everything." "He's intractable." "Then you must be more persuasive," Richard said. "You must make him understand the consequences of his actions, or rather, his inaction. Does he understand what he has? This house? This lifestyle? He came from nothing, Isabella. He thinks this is normal. He doesn't realize it can all be taken away." There was a pause. Ethan held his breath. "The house is in his name, Daddy," Isabella said quietly. "Most of the assets are. I checked." "A temporary problem," Richard shot back. "We need leverage, something that forces his hand. Men like Ethan, these quiet, stubborn types, they are terrified of losing everything. They cling to their little nests. You must threaten the nest, Isabella. You must make him believe that his refusal to help Liam will result in his own total destruction. You must be ruthless." "Ruthless?" she repeated, the words sounding fragile on her lips. "Yes, ruthless," Richard insisted. "This is not a time for sentiment. This is about survival. Our survival. You are a Croft. You will do what is necessary. I'll have my lawyers draft something, a post-nuptial, something that signs away his rights to everything if he doesn't comply. We'll corner him. He'll have no choice." Ethan stepped back silently from the doorway, his heart a cold, heavy weight in his chest. He had known this was coming in a way. He had prepared for it. But hearing the woman he loved being coached to destroy him by her own father, was a unique kind of pain. It was the final confirmation. There was nothing left to save. He retreated to his study and sent a simple, two-word text to Alistair Vance. "They're moving." The reply was almost instantaneous. "We're ready." The following days saw a shift in Isabella. The cold distance was replaced by a brittle, almost manic confidence. She started dressing in power suits, her hair pulled back severely. She was a woman on a mission, a soldier in her father's army. She was no longer fighting for her marriage. She was fighting for her inheritance, for her place in the Croft dynasty. She believed she was setting a trap. She felt the thrill of the hunt, the righteous certainty of her cause. She and her father worked closely with a team of lawyers, the same firm Richard had used for decades, to craft the perfect legal weapon. They spent hours in meetings, honing each clause, ensuring every loophole was closed. The document was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, designed to strip Ethan of any claim to the marital home, the art collection, the vehicles, and to leave him saddled with a moral and potentially legal obligation to resolve Liam's debts. Their fatal, catastrophic mistake was the choice of lawyer to oversee the final signing. "We need someone he'll see as impartial," Richard had strategized. "Someone who can present it as a simple formality. What about Vance? Alistair Vance. He's done work for me for years, but he has that independent, elder statesman reputation. Ethan might trust him." It was the height of arrogance. Richard saw Alistair Vance as a tool, a respected name he could purchase and deploy as needed. He had no concept of true loyalty, only of transactional relationships. He never imagined that Vance, a man of deep integrity and a longtime friend of Ethan's late father, might have allegiances that couldn't be bought. Vance had, in fact, been Ethan's personal lawyer and mentor since Ethan had inherited his father's small but respectable portfolio. It was Vance who had helped him structure the anonymous Aethelred designs. It was Vance who had drafted the complex trust agreements that protected Ethan's assets. And it was Vance who had, for 3 long years, been playing a long, quiet game, waiting for the Crofts to make their move. When Richard Croft called Alistair Vance's office and requested his services to handle a delicate family matter, Vance agreed with sober professionalism. He listened patiently as Richard outlined the plan to corner his own son-in-law. He accepted the draft of the post-nuptial agreement for review. That night, he met with Ethan in his own, far more discreet office. He slid the Crofts document across his desk. "It's as brutish as we expected," Vance said, his lip curling in distaste. "They think they've covered every angle." Ethan read through it, his face impassive. He saw his life, their life together, reduced to a list of assets to be seized. He saw the utter contempt they had for him, written out in cold, legalistic language. "They've left us a perfect opening," Ethan said, pointing to a specific clause. "Right here. They're so focused on what I have to give up, they've defined the terms of the separation completely in their favor. They've made my signature the trigger for the entire settlement." Vance nodded, a grim smile on his face. "Exactly. They've built a cage and they're so proud of it they haven't noticed the door is unlocked and the key is in your pocket. All you have to do is walk through it. By signing their document, you are legally accepting their proposed terms for the dissolution of the marriage. And their terms are that you keep your business and they get, well, in the end, they get nothing." "And Isabella?" Ethan asked, the name a whisper of a wound. "She's made her choice, son," Vance said gently. "She's chosen her side. All you are doing now is acknowledging that choice." Ethan looked down at the document, at the culmination of his wife's betrayal. The trap was set, the bait was laid, and he, the intended victim, was about to walk in and turn it on the trappers. The quiet before the storm was over. The day of the signing was set. The scene in Alistair Vance's conference room was exactly as Ethan had pictured it. The Crofts, arranged on one side of the table, radiated an almost suffocating aura of smug entitlement. They were predators who had cornered their prey and were now savoring the final moments before the kill. Isabella, in a sharp, blood-red dress, was the very picture of icy command. Her father, Richard, leaned back in his chair, a king surveying his court, while Liam vibrated with a nervous energy, the anticipation of his salvation making him twitchy. They had made Ethan wait, a classic power play. He'd been sitting in the leather chair for 10 minutes, his old worn portfolio resting on the floor beside him, when they swept in, a whirlwind of self-importance. They didn't apologize for their tardiness. They expected his gratitude for their eventual arrival. And now the moment had arrived. The document he had just signed lay in the center of the table, a testament to their victory. Richard's booming voice filled the stunned silence that had followed Vance's bombshell revelation. "What is this? Vance, what is the meaning of this? You work for me," Richard sputtered, his face mottling with confusion and rage. He was a man whose entire world was built on the assumption that everyone had a price, and he had always been able to pay it. The idea that loyalty could exist outside a transaction was utterly foreign to him. Alistair Vance turned his head slowly, fixing Richard with a gaze as cold and hard as a diamond. "Actually, Richard, I haven't worked for you in any meaningful capacity for over 6 months. My firm has handled some minor filings your staff sent over, but my primary client, for the last 8 years, has been sitting right here." He gestured with a respectful nod towards Ethan. "8 years?" Isabella whispered, the sound barely audible. The timeline didn't make sense. They'd only been married for 5. "Indeed, Ms. Croft, Vance continued, his voice crisp and clear, each word a hammer blow to the foundations of their reality. Before he was your husband, Mr. Sterling was my client. And not just any client. I have the distinct honor of representing the founder, sole proprietor, and chief architect of the Athelred Design Group. The name hung in the air, meaningless to the Crofts. They exchanged blank, confused looks. Vance's smile was thin and sharp. You may know it by its more public-facing brand, Sterling Designs. It's a recent rebranding, preparing for a more public phase. Perhaps you've heard of it? Winner of the National Architectural Prize for the last 3 years running, the firm behind the Helios Tower in Chicago, the Biosphere Project in Singapore, the very same firm that is currently designing the new National Museum? The silence was deafening. Richard's jaw, which had been set in a belligerent line, went slack. Eleanor, who had been observing the proceedings with bored detachment, suddenly sat bolt upright, her pearls clattering against the table. Liam looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. That's impossible, Richard stammered. Sterling Designs is a giant, a monolith. It's run by some mysterious, reclusive genius, some European eccentric, they say. Ethan finally spoke. His voice, after the long silence, was calm and resonant, filling the room with an authority they had never heard from him before. The reclusive genius was a useful fiction, he said, as he reached down and placed his worn leather portfolio on the table with a soft thud. It allowed me to focus on the work, not the noise. I find that the best work is done quietly. He unfastened the simple brass clasps. The Crofts watched, mesmerized, as if expecting blueprints for a modest home extension. Instead, Ethan's hands moved with practiced familiarity, pulling out not drawings, but thick stacks of documents, each bound in its own folder. He laid them out in a neat row, a series of irrefutable facts. This was it, the moment he had dreaded and, on some level, prepared for since the day he realized his wife's love was conditional. This was the list of grievances. He looked directly at Richard. You once called my work drawing pretty little houses. It was at your birthday dinner 3 years ago. Richard paled, a flicker of memory in his eyes. A fair assessment from your perspective, Ethan continued, his voice devoid of malice, stating facts. However, one of those pretty little houses is the new regional headquarters for Omnicorp, a building praised for its innovative energy efficiency and structural design. He slid a folder across the table. On its cover was a glossy photograph of a stunning, futuristic glass building. You sit on Omnicorp's board of directors, Richard. Every quarter you attend meetings in a building that exists because of my modest profession. You praise its design to your colleagues, never knowing you were praising the man you dismissed at your own dinner table. Richard stared at the photograph, his mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Ethan's gaze shifted to Liam. And you, Liam, you mocked my caution about your Pinnacle project. You called my advice technicalities. You were right, they were technicalities. Zoning laws, soil composition, community opposition, the boring little details that separate a successful project from a crater in the ground full of investors' money. He pushed another file toward the stunned young man. The community board that so effectively blocked your zoning variance, the Waterfront Preservation Society, its largest anonymous donor is the Sterling Trust. I couldn't stand by and watch that historic park be overshadowed by your monument to greed. I didn't want my name, or my wife's name, associated with such a shoddy, ill-conceived venture. So I quietly ensured it would fail before it could do any real damage to the city. Liam shrank in his chair, the last of his bravado evaporating, leaving behind the hollow shell of a boy who had been playing dress-up in his father's world. Finally, Ethan's eyes found Eleanor. And you, Eleanor, your greatest fear was a loss of social standing, a stain on the family name. He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle. My firm, under its old name, has endowed the new wing of the art museum you so desperately wanted to be on the board of. It has funded the symphony orchestra for the next decade. The very social fabric you pride yourself on being a part of has been woven, in part, with threads from my little projects. The entire time you were looking down on me, you were standing on the foundations I built. He let the silence stretch, allowing the full weight of their blindness, their catastrophic misjudgment, to crush them. They had lived in a world he had helped create, all while mocking him for not being a part of it. The irony was so immense, so profound, it was almost poetic. They were not just wrong about him, they were fundamentally wrong about the nature of the world they inhabited. They had mistaken the decorations for the structure, the performance of wealth for the reality of power. And now the walls of their delusion were crashing down around them, and the architect of it all was sitting calmly at the head of the table, holding the master blueprint. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't used a single insult. He had simply held up a mirror, a perfectly polished, brutally honest mirror, and forced them to look at their own reflections. And the image staring back was one of foolish, arrogant, and utterly powerless people. Then, after the demolition of her family was complete, he turned to Isabella. All the cold precision left his voice, replaced by a deep, resonant sadness. The anger was gone, burned away over years of quiet disappointments. All that remained was the ache of what might have been. He looked at the woman he had loved, the woman he had chosen, the woman for whom he had hidden his own light under a bushel, hoping she would love the man in the shadows. He saw her now, not as his wife, but as a stranger in a red dress, her face a canvas of shock and dawning horror. "You said to me, 'Sign it or lose everything,'" he began, his voice soft, almost a whisper, yet it commanded the absolute attention of the room. "I thought about that ultimatum all morning. I realized you were right. I was about to lose everything. In fact, I already had. I had lost your respect, which I now see I never truly had. I had lost your loyalty, which you gave so freely to them and so sparingly to me. And I had lost your love, if what we had could even be called that now." He gestured to the post-nuptial agreement, their weapon, now his shield. "So I signed it. I signed it because you were right. It was a choice, and you had already made yours. You chose them. You chose this performance of status over the reality of our partnership. You were willing to bankrupt me, to humiliate me, to throw me to the wolves to protect the very people who have belittled me, and by extension, you, for our entire marriage." Isabella started to speak, a desperate "Ethan, I" forming on her lips, but he held up a hand, not to silence her, but to ask for a final moment to be heard. "So I gave you exactly what you wanted," he continued, his voice steady, a surgeon making a final, clean incision. "The document you forced me to sign is a legally binding agreement on the terms of our separation. And your terms were that you waive all rights to my personal and business assets, the assets of Ethan Sterling. You never knew what those assets were. You never cared to ask. You just assumed they were insignificant." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes holding hers. "The house, Isabella, the one you threatened me with? It was purchased by the Sterling Trust 5 years ago. I am the sole trustee. You were, legally speaking, a guest. The cars? Leased through Aethelred Designs. The club memberships? Corporate perks. The art? The jewelry? All purchased by the trust. The life you thought was yours was always simply mine to give. And now, it is mine to take back." The finality of his words struck her like a physical blow. The red dress, which had seemed like a symbol of power, now looked like a splash of blood against her ashen skin. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in denial. "No, Ethan, I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I love you." The plea, which might have once shattered his resolve, now only clarified his decision. He gave her a sad, tired smile. That, Isabella, is the saddest part of all. You didn't know. In 5 years of marriage, you never truly saw me. You slept next to a stranger. You ate breakfast with a ghost. And how can you love a stranger? He paused, letting the moral mirror he held up reflect her own actions back at her. You didn't love me. You loved the comfort I provided. You loved the easy life that you mistook for your own. And the moment you thought that comfort was threatened, you didn't fight for us. You fought for them. You tried to cage the man you married without ever realizing the size of the world he lived in. The dam of her composure finally broke. A sob, raw and ugly, tore from her throat. It was the sound of a queen realizing her castle was a sandcastle, and the tide was her own husband. Richard, seeing his daughter crumble and his entire world order upended, found his voice again, a roar of impotent rage. This is a trick, a fraud. I'll have you in court for the rest of your life, Sterling. Vance, you're finished. You're disbarred. Alistair Vance looked at the apoplectic man with something akin to pity. Save your breath, Richard, he said coolly. Every action Mr. Sterling has taken has been meticulously planned and is 100% legal. He has fulfilled the terms of your own agreement to the letter. In fact, he's been remarkably generous. The post-nuptial you drafted is so aggressively one-sided in its waiver of spousal claims on his assets that it will be virtually impossible to challenge. You built a fortress to keep him out, and in doing so, you locked yourselves in a prison of your own making. Vance closed his briefcase with a definitive snap. The divorce filings will be delivered to your respective homes this afternoon. The locks on the main house will be changed at 5 p.m. A car is waiting downstairs for Ms. Croft. It will take her to a hotel where a suite has been booked in her name for the next month, all expenses paid. A final courtesy from Mr. Sterling. Ethan stood up. He left the portfolio, the deeds, the proof of his hidden life spread across the table. He didn't need them anymore. He looked at the wreckage of the Croft family, Richard sputtering and red-faced, Eleanor weeping silently into a silk handkerchief, Liam staring into space, a zombie, and Isabella, broken. He felt a pang, not of victory, but of profound loss. He had won, but what had he really gained? Freedom, yes, but it was a freedom born from the death of a dream. He walked to the door, his footsteps echoing in the tomb-like silence. As he opened it, Isabella's voice, choked with tears, called out one last time, "Ethan, please, don't." He paused in the doorway, his back still to her. "It's already done, Isabella," he said softly. And then he walked out, leaving them to the ruins of the world they had built on arrogance and pride, and stepped out into the clean, open air of his own. The days that followed the confrontation were like the slow, inexorable settling of a demolished building. The dust of the initial explosion gave way to the grim reality of the wreckage. For the Croft family, the consequences were swift and brutal, a cascade of poetic justice that followed the logical path of their own transgressions. Richard Croft discovered that reputation, the currency he valued above all others, was as volatile as the stocks he traded. The story of his failed attempt to defraud his own son-in-law, who was revealed to be the reclusive titan Ethan Sterling, spread like wildfire through the city's elite circles. It was not the kind of story that engendered respect. It was a tale of greed, stupidity, and epic misjudgment. He was not seen as a ruthless player, but as a fool. He was quietly asked to resign from the board of Omnicorp. It was too embarrassing to have him attend meetings in a building designed by the man he tried to ruin. Other board invitations evaporated. His calls to influential friends were met with polite but firm distance. He had shown himself to be not just a shark, but a clumsy one, and in his world, that was a fatal flaw. He was left with his money, but stripped of the status that gave it meaning, a king ruling over a kingdom of one. Liam's fall was less nuanced and far more rapid. Without the protective shield of his family's influence and financial backing, his creditors descended. The investors he had charmed with his vision now saw him for what he was, a charlatan. Lawsuits were filed. His company, The Pinnacle, which had never been more than a name on a brochure, was declared bankrupt. He was forced to sell his luxury apartment, his sports car, everything. He ended up back in his childhood bedroom, in his parents' now stuffy and silent mansion. A 30-year-old man-child whose dreams had turned to ash, facing a future of legal battles and personal ruin. He had wanted to play in the big leagues, and he had struck out in spectacular fashion. Eleanor's punishment was perhaps the most subtle, and for her, the most cruel. Her social life, the very core of her existence, disintegrated. The friends who had once clamored for invitations to her parties now avoided her at the club. She was an object of pity and, worse, of gossip. The women she had competed with now looked at her with a kind of predatory sympathy, their eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of seeing her brought low. She was no longer the matriarch of a powerful dynasty, but the mother of a failure and the wife of a laughingstock. Her world, once a vibrant stage, had become a small, quiet, lonely room. And Isabella was adrift. The car that Alistair Vance had arranged took her from the sterile law office to an equally sterile luxury hotel suite. For the first few days, she existed in a state of shock, cycling through disbelief, rage, and a grief so profound it left her breathless. She called Ethan's phone 100 times, but it went straight to a new, unfamiliar voicemail message. She sent a barrage of texts, angry, pleading, apologetic, that went unanswered. They were marked as delivered, but never read. A small, technological cruelty that felt like a twisting knife. After the first week, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was alone. The life she had known was over, and the door back to it was not just locked, but had vanished entirely. Her family, consumed with their own spectacular implosions, had no comfort to offer. Calls with her mother devolved into shared weeping sessions. Calls with her father were filled with his bitter, self-pitying rage directed at everyone but himself. The month at the hotel, Ethan's final courtesy, expired. The credit card he had provided was declined. With a single suitcase containing a few clothes and personal effects, she checked out. The doorman who had greeted her with a fawning, "Good day, Mrs. Sterling," a month ago now barely made eye contact as he hailed a simple taxi for Ms. Croft. Ethan had made one other arrangement, a final quiet act that was either kindness or the ultimate, most painful lesson. Alistair Vance had contacted her and informed her that a modest, one-bedroom apartment had been leased in her name for 1 year, in a respectable but unremarkable neighborhood far from the gilded cage she had once called home. The first and last month's rent were paid. After that, she was on her own. For the first time in her life, Isabella Croft had to think about a budget. She had to learn to take the subway, to grocery shop, to cook for herself. The abstract concepts of rent, utilities, and invoices became harsh, concrete realities. Stripped of the name Sterling and the status of Croft, she was just a woman in her late 20s with a degree in art history, no work experience, and a dwindling bank account. The world was no longer her oyster. It was a vast, indifferent ocean, and she had just been taught how to swim by being thrown into the deep end. She was forced, day by painful day, to confront the woman in the mirror, and to ask a question she had never before considered. Without a wealthy father or a powerful husband, who was she? 6 months passed. 6 months of a new calendar, a new season. The world moved on, as it always does. The name Sterling Designs was no longer a secret whispered among industry insiders. It was now emblazoned in clean, minimalist steel letters on the glass doors of a stunning new office building downtown, a building Ethan himself had designed. The space was the antithesis of the Croft mansion. It was full of light, open and collaborative, with soaring ceilings and walls of glass that looked out over the city he was reshaping. There was no heavy, dark wood, no ostentatious displays of wealth. The luxury here was in the space, the light, the quiet confidence of its design. Ethan was different too. The quiet, watchful stillness was still there, but it was no longer a defensive crouch. It was the calm of a man at peace in his own skin. He had shed the ill-fitting costume of Isabella's husband and was now simply, fully, Ethan Sterling. He worked long hours, but they were hours filled with passion, not obligation. He laughed more easily with his colleagues. He took lunch breaks. He walked through the construction sites of his projects, not as a mysterious overseer, but as a leader, known and respected by the engineers and construction workers who brought his visions to life. One crisp autumn afternoon, Alistair Vance stopped by the office. The two men were more than just lawyer and client now. They were friends, bonded by the long, strange campaign they had waged. "The library is looking magnificent," Alistair said, looking at the scale model that dominated the center of Ethan's office. It was a new public library for the city's most underserved neighborhood, a project Ethan was funding personally through his foundation. "It's my favorite kind of project," Ethan said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Strong foundations, open to everyone, and built to last." The metaphor hung in the air between them. "I had a call from the realty company today," Alistair said, his tone shifting slightly. "The lease on Isabella's apartment is halfway through. They just wanted to confirm if the automatic renewal should be kept in place." Ethan's smile faded. He walked over to the large window and looked down at the bustling city below. He hadn't spoken to Isabella, hadn't seen her, since that day in the conference room. He had instructed Vance to handle all communication, creating an impenetrable wall between their two worlds. "What should I tell them?" Alistair asked gently. Ethan was silent for a long moment, his reflection a faint ghost in the glass. "Let the lease run its course," he said finally. "After that, she's on her own. It's what she needs to do. It's what I need her to do." Alistair nodded, understanding the unspoken sentiment. It wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about allowing the consequences to be real, to be formative. It was about letting go. Miles away, in a world that felt like a different planet, Isabella Croft was arranging canvases in a small, independent art gallery. The job was menial, the pay was minimal, but it was hers. She had gotten it on her own, armed with her forgotten art history degree and a newfound, desperate humility. The owner, a kind, no-nonsense woman named Sarah, had hired her despite her complete lack of a resume. "You know your art," Sarah had said, "but you don't know anything about work. Show me you can learn." And Isabella had learned. She learned to be on time. She learned to handle angry customers. She learned to sweep the floors and make coffee. She learned the quiet satisfaction of earning a paycheck, no matter how small. For the first time, she was building something of her own, even if it was just a life. She was thinner now, and the expensive clothes were gone, replaced by simple, practical outfits. The biggest change was in her eyes. The hard, glittering certainty was gone, replaced by a softer, more sorrowful wisdom. She had spent 6 months excavating the ruins of her life, and she was finally beginning to understand the flaws in its original design. That evening, in her small, quiet apartment, she sat down at her kitchen table with a simple piece of stationery and a pen. She began to write. It was not a plea for forgiveness, nor a request for a second chance. It was not for him at all, not really. It was for her. It was a confession, a reckoning. "Dear Ethan," she wrote, her handwriting less of a confident flourish and more of a careful, deliberate script. "I don't know if you will ever read this, and I don't expect a reply. I am not writing to ask for anything. I am writing because I owe you the truth, a truth I have only recently come to understand myself. I am sorry. Those words are so small for the damage I have done, but they are the only ones I have. I am sorry for my blindness, for my weakness, for my vanity. I am sorry I never saw you. I was so busy looking at the life I wanted, I never bothered to look at the man who was giving it to me. You were right. I didn't love you. I couldn't have. I didn't know you. I loved an idea, a lifestyle, a security that I mistook for love. I failed you, and I failed myself. I spent our entire marriage trying to turn you into a Croft, never realizing that the greatest gift you gave me was not being one. I don't know what my future holds, but for the first time, it feels like it is mine to build. Thank you for that. In destroying the life I thought I wanted, you have given me a chance to find a life that is real. I hope you are happy. I hope you are at peace. I wish you well, truly. She signed it simply, Isabella. She placed the letter in an envelope, addressed it to Alistair Vance's office with a note to forward it, and dropped it in a mailbox the next morning. It felt like letting go of a stone she had been carrying in her heart for 6 long months. It was a final, quiet act of surrender. A few days later, the letter arrived on Ethan's desk. Alistair had left it there without comment. Ethan recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately. His first instinct was to throw it away, to not let her voice, even on paper, pierce the peace he had so carefully constructed. But his curiosity, or perhaps some lingering echo of the man who had once loved her, made him pick it up. He read it slowly, then read it again. There were no excuses, no blame, no hidden manipulations. There was only a stark, painful honesty. It was the first truly honest communication she had ever sent him. He saw in her words the faint outline of the woman he had once hoped she could become. A woman of substance, not just style. He folded the letter and put it in his desk drawer. He would not reply. There was nothing left to say between them. Their story was over. But as he looked out the window at the city skyline, a skyline he knew so intimately, he felt a final, quiet shift within him. The anger was gone. The sadness had faded. In its place was a sense of peace, of closure. Her apology had not been for him, but for her. And his acceptance of it was not for her, but for him. It was the final beam being slotted into place, the last bolt tightened. The structure of his new life was complete. It was sound, it was strong, and it was his. The moral of this story is not about revenge. Revenge is a fire that burns the person who holds it. This is a story about value. The Croft family believed a person's value was measured in their name, their social standing, their visible wealth. They were wrong. Ethan knew that true value lies in what you build, in the integrity of your character and the quiet strength of your principles. He built an empire in silence, not because he was hiding, but because he was testing the world around him. He wanted to be valued for the quality of his work, not the size of his bank account. His wife and her family failed that test. They saw a quiet man and assumed he was a weak one. They saw a simple life and assumed it was a small one. Their tragedy was not that they lost their fortune. It was that they were never able to recognize the true fortune that was standing right in front of them all along. In the end, Ethan Sterling did not become cruel or vindictive. He simply removed himself from the equation. He let the consequences of their own actions play out, a perfect, natural, and just result. He continued to build, not just buildings of steel and glass, but a life of purpose and authenticity. He found his vindication not in their downfall, but in his own quiet, unassailable peace. True strength isn't about how loudly you can roar. It's about having the dignity and integrity to walk away from those who are not worthy of your presence, and the wisdom to build a world where your own value is the foundation. What do you think? Have you ever had to walk away from a situation where you felt completely unseen and undervalued? The hardest choices often lead to the most profound growth. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and your perspectives are what make this community so incredible. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you enjoyed this journey, please give this video a like. Subscribe for more stories of justice and vindication. And until next time, remember to know your own worth, even when others don't.